in Vienna, in this hospital where he worked, there were two wards. On the one ward, it was all nurses, and on the other ward, it was all doctors. And the women would come in to have their babies, and if the nurses delivered their babies, the women did very well. They did not do that badly. But if the doctors delivered their babies, they had what was called puerperal fever. They got really bad infections, and a certain percentage of them died. It was horrible. For matter of fact, they had different days. This harkens back to my training, because I trained in New Orleans, Louisiana, and we would have LSU days, and then we'd have Tulane days. I was a Tulane resident. But there, they had the midwife days and then the doctor days. If it was the women of Vienna were so afraid to go in the hospital on a doctor days, they would rather have their babies in the street, okay? So this guy starts to do research as to why is it that so many women are getting infected. So he observed what they did, what the doctors did, and then he observed what the midwives did. The midwives always changed their clothing, they washed their hands, and then they delivered the babies. The doctors, it actually was a mark of pride to go to deliver a baby coming straight from the morgue, because you actually had to be well off to become a doctor at that time, because you had to have enough money to buy the cadavers to do the dissections. So you wanted people to know that you were doing dissection. So you'd walk around in these coats that were covered in blood and pus, and that was a mark of honor. And so they would have these coats on, they would go deliver the babies, and the women, not surprisingly, would get infections. Next slide. So this guy, Semmelweis, says, well, since I'm in charge of the ward, I'm going to make the doctors take off these dirty coats, put on clean clothing, and wash their hands. And guess what? The infection rate plummets. Success. He publishes his findings. It took him a long time to publish because the medical community did not want to publish it, but he finally found a journal that would publish it, and you would think, oh, okay, oh, wow, that's the end of the story. The doctors all embraced it, and the story went on from there. Well, no, that's not what happened. Actually, he was totally, completely ostracized, and he was fired from his job. He actually had mental illness after that and died broke. It was horrible what happened to him. The medical community did not embrace this finding at all for a couple of reasons. Number one, like I said, he was Hungarian, so he was it came from the wrong messenger. Number two, he was telling them to do something that mostly women were doing, right? That the medical community was not going to embrace that. So in contradistinction to what I said about the Roman Empire in taking in these diverse ideas, the medical community was not interested in taking in diverse ideas at all. Next slide. Now, this is in the 1840s. About 15 or 20 years later, Joseph Lister, you've heard of Listerine, Joseph Lister, who was Scottish, not Hungarian, he was a surgeon, and he also had science to back him up. So even if you were an empiricist, what Joseph Lister did was a little bit different than Semmelweis. He was making the same arguments, that we should wear clean clothing, that we should wash our hands, but fortuitously, his father was one of the early creators of microscopes. So he could actually see these little particles that were moving around, with his microscope, and he started this idea of Listerism. And that's actually how the medical community changed. Next slide. But, it's ironic, I'm a surgeon, so we go through antisepsis every day in the operating room. But in these two lithographs from the time, the one on the left, these are both very famous surgeons. The one on the left, the Gross Clinic, this is in the 1870s. So this is still about 20 years after Listerism. And you can see he's not wearing gloves. They're still wearing these old dingy frock coats. So nothing had changed in the 10 to 15 years after even Listerism had become accepted in some places. But about 15 years after that, the late 1880s, is when this is the Agnew Clinic, both of them up in Boston. Now you have surgeons wearing gloves. They're actually cleaning the patients with antiseptics. So it took a long time. Eventually, it was embraced by the medical community, but it took decades. The number one reason, up until this most recent pandemic, the thing that killed the most Americans was the Civil War. More than half of those deaths in the Civil War was due to infection because Listerism was not followed, although it had been invented. Next slide. Vivian Thomas. I hope you guys saw the movie, something that the Lord made. It was all about Vivian Thomas. Again, you want to talk about diversity. You want to talk about somebody outside of the norm, outside of dogma. This guy was a 19-year-old, uneducated black kid in the Deep South, in Tennessee. And this very highly esteemed white surgeon was trying to solve a problem that he couldn't solve. And he wanted to try to save the lives of these babies, blue babies. I hope you guys know what a blue baby syndrome, tetralogy of Fallot, which used to, all of these babies used to die before their third birthday or fourth birthday. And so surgeons had to figure out how to fix this problem. And eventually, it was fixed, and the beginning of open heart surgery in this country was created by a carpenter. That's who Vivian Thomas was. I love to tell people that Vivian Thomas, although he's from Tennessee, the Thomas family, where he was actually born, is from New Iberia, Louisiana, which is just down the road from where I grew up, and we're related to the Thomases. So this was one of my cousins. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so here at this very place, I told you a little bit about myself, but the procedure that I utilize to be able to do transplants in people that otherwise would have horrible rejections, it's called plasmapheresis or apheresis. That whole process started by this man, Charles Drew, who was chairman of surgery here for some time. One of the ironies of Charles Drew is when he wanted to go to medical school, this guy was a great athlete, and he was brilliant, and he had made 1B as an undergrad at Amherst. And because he made 1B, he couldn't get into Howard Medical School, right? You guys complain about getting into school and stuff. He made 1B and couldn't get in. So he winds up going to actually the Harvard of Canada. He goes to McGill, and he was a brilliant student. And eventually does this research to try to figure out if there was a way that we could help Britain. World War II had started, and he was trying to figure out a way to send blood and blood products to England. And he came up with this concept of separating blood into its constitutive parts, plasma and then cells. And that way you can store it. So he's the guy that basically invented blood banking. And we were able to send lots of plasma to Britain, and but famously he had become president of the American Blood Bank. Red Cross, and he resigned from that position because they wanted to start segregating blood by race, which they did do, and he resigned, and then he was a very young man when he died in a car accident while he was here, chairman of surgery at Howard. Next slide. So yeah, this is me, and like I said, these are two sides of what I do. I'm a surgeon, so I operate on people, but I've realized that a lot more can be influenced by kind of what I'm doing today. I do a lot of outreach into the community, trying to educate people about their diseases, but really just trying to break down the barriers that keep people from having good access to healthcare. Next slide. Yeah, I love this. I got into Rothko some time ago, and I have a Rothko in my office. Now, of course, it's a reproduction because this painting right here, about 10 years ago, sold for $20 million. So I don't actually have a real Rothko in my office. But at the Smithsonian, there's a Rothko room. I encourage you to go. But he was a great artist. This is about this particular piece which is all of his pieces are similar, but it's about how the color scheme is beautiful, and you don't have to mix it all together, you can let them stand alone, but they can be harmonious. So it's diversity versus assimilation. Next slide. So, I think this is an appropriate ending. If you go, one of my favorite places to go is the Lincoln Memorial, and these words are there at the memorial, and it's what we need to really keep in our focus. It's ironic because if you look at what Lincoln was writing at the beginning of the Civil War and what he writes at the end of the Civil War, when he gets to Gettysburg, is very different. Because that's how life is. I told you about my journey. I didn't think I had any interest in public health or in any sort of primary care at all. And yet my career has taught me how important this is. It's what you guys do, being on the front lines, is actually much more important. You impact a lot more lives than any surgeon because, I can only impact the people I operate on. You can change behaviors. Next slide. Yeah, this is Miles Davis, by the way, in case you didn't know that. One of my favorite jazz artists. Remember, I'm from New Orleans, so. Questions? I just wanted to open it up to questions.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Loved it. Loved it. Dr. Khan has his hand up. Go ahead. Let me bring the speaker.
Your presence itself, yeah, your presence here is very good example of diversity. Why the diversity is important, why you are here. I would like to know. I have two questions. My first question is, as a member of minority, and the leadership role that you achieve in your professional life, what are the challenges that you personally face? That's question number one. And question number two is, as you are the leadership role, as you are right now, what are the challenges thinking of that are barrier to the diversity? Why we are not able to make that?
Great question. In case you guys couldn't hear, he asked me, what challenges, that I face, obviously being a minority in my career to get to where I am today. And then, what are the challenges in a leadership role at a majority institution of trying to push even diversity at that institution? And those are two great questions. And I can tell you that, I face lots of challenges. And I was talking to a group just yesterday, and I told them that although when people looked at me as when I was a student and I wanted to be a surgeon, they didn't see what was in my head, right? They didn't see my thoughts, my dreams, my aspirations. Well, I'll give you one little vignette. I remember when, and I don't know if you guys still do this in medical school, but when I got into medical school, the upper level students would always sell their microscopes to the lower level students. So when you were a first year, the person that had finished histology and everything, they would sell you their microscope. So I went and I was, and they put ads out. So I go to buy a microscope from one of the students. And she was like, oh, okay, so you're one of the first year students. What are you interested in? And I said, oh, I'm interested in being a surgeon. Remember, I told you, I was one of those people I knew since I was a child that I wanted to be a surgeon. And she said, oh, that's too hard. I don't think that you... Now, she didn't know me from anyone. I mean, I'm just buying a microscope from her. But I realized that, one of the most important things I had received, and I know that I'm lucky for this, from my parents, but my mother in particular. My mother used to always tell me and my brother, you can be whatever you want to be, right? And, it's a very simple thing, and I've done this with my kids as well, but it enabled me to have this impermeable kind of, outer shell, like a crawfish. Anybody know about crawfish? You probably think more like lobsters, but, where I'm from, we have crawfish. But, we had this I was just not going to be perturbed from my mission. Every step along the way, I had to make people see what was in my mind. They did not see me as a surgeon or a transplant surgeon or whatnot, but I had to change them to get them to believe in my vision. And being diverse is actually or can be an advantage. Now, I'm not saying that the challenges that we go through are not real and we shouldn't work to try to undo these barriers, but for me in particular, it made me have to strive a lot harder. I remember when I was an intern, we would work, unlike the rules of today, you guys have all these work hour things. There was no such thing as that. We used to just work until the work was done. And so we would go to the call room at the end of the night, when we were on call, and we worked like dogs. I mean, this was back when, 100-hour weeks were just the norm. So my fellow intern, who was white, we would get to the call room, and he would go to sleep. He'd get in his bed and he'd go to sleep. And then I would turn the light on because I was trying to read as much as I could until I fell asleep. And he would look at me. He's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm reading," because I knew that what was expected of him and what was expected of me was a little bit different. So you fast forward a few months later, and we had this visiting professor, and we had to present the patients because we were interns. So he was presenting his patient, and the professor asked him what was going on with the patient, and then to describe gram-negative sepsis. And then he said, "How do you treat gram-negative sepsis? And give me just a random sampling of all the gram-negative organisms that could be causing the infection." Well, he drew a complete blank. And then the professor turns to me, and I just read the chapter on gram-negative sepsis, so I just reel off all of these, and then I realized from then on, I think I knew before, but from then on I was like, wow, this reading does pay off, And so by the end of my residency, I used to score the highest score in the AppSite exam, and that was from pushing myself. Now, could I have been white and done that? Of course. But the point is that the challenges can make us better because we have to push ourselves. But it's important to have an advocate. Okay, so that's how I'm going to answer your second question. At GW, I don't know if you know this, but right here at your institution, I guess just recently passed chairman of surgery, Eddie, what's Eddie's last name? Cornwell. All right, so Eddie Cornwell's father was the first black resident at GW in surgery. First ever, Eddie Sr. And however, in all these many years, there had only been, in Washington, D.C., at this institution, there had only been 4 black residents. I mean, it's crazy, right? So myself and others, we, decided that we needed to be on the resident committee. I had always voted, but we realized that it's not that there was any volitional kind of movement to exclude black students, but there were a lot of subjective things that were disqualifying great black students from even being considered. One of them was they had this idea of, after all the objective stuff, right? What are your test scores? What's your grade point average? Where'd you go to medical school? All of that, that's all standard. But then after everything objective, there was this last little question of how likely are they to come to GW? And we were like, well, why even ask this question, But guess what? The people that they thought were likely to come tended to look like them, right? So you would have these phenomenal applicants, and they would say, oh, not likely to come to GW, right? So by changing that one thing, we threw that question out. I was like, that's stupid. This upcoming class, we have an African-American male, first time in decades. We have a Native American. We've never had a Native American resident. We have a female Hispanic resident, and we also have an Indian resident. So 4 out of the 5 residents are minority. So So that's how you have to have an advocate. You have to get in those rooms. So for us, and this was I learned, is we have to sign up to be on these committees. Our presence has to be there, because if you're not there, if you don't have a vote, if you don't have a voice, then the status quo will keep us out. So I'm sorry, that was a long-winded way of answering your question.
One more question. Habib, you want to come down?
I would like to, I think it can be a bit loud.
No.
I truly enjoyed your,
1 second. I know I have trouble here.
sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Rana. Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed the lecture and the elements of the lecture that you rightfully pointed out from the history. But being a Louisiana person, I really missed you mentioning Frantz Fanon, Creole-speaking, French-speaking, young psychiatrist. The reason I still say young psychiatrist, because he unfortunately passed at age 36 in Bethesda, Maryland. But his writing are really monumental in the experience of oppressed, black, and other minorities, immigrants, any index of division matters on his writings. His great monumental book, Black Skin, White Mask, points to his experience as a young physician, psychiatrist, growing up in a French colony of Martinique, and really getting involved in the Algeria uprising against the French colonialists.
Uh-huh.
Long story short, his experience points to one fact, that for any blackness does not become primary. The ontology of black is from the fact, the negation of whiteness. That is how, in philosophy, really, because as you said, race is a social construct. There is no truth in any shape or form in the division that has come to our races. It's just the fact that all of us have vitamin D processing physiology in us, and we move from Africa, outside the Africa, and then in order for us to survive, we lose the pigment. And that's how the whole thing began. So all of us were black to begin with.
Right.
But again, the fact that in 21st century, any black person has to prove itself secondary to the fact that he's not white, that is the problem. And the problem is there's not diversity. When it's preached to immigrants, to blacks, to other minorities, we can strive, and you absolutely brought beautiful examples of how we could be successful. But the fact is, it has to be looked by the powers to be, by the prevalent, dominant race, which I advocate putting in quotation mark, that it has to be accepted by the white, that it has never been. In the 21st century, we are still dealing. Every year, he has to put the conference on a stigma, and the major stigma is the color of our skin.
Right.
So I really, truly enjoyed all those books. Beautiful, Eliot's marking of all those things. But I would like, because I brought that name, Frantz Fanon, I always tell my students, you want to see experience of your fellow man? Read those books.
Yeah.
Read Black Skin, White Mask, and the fact that every minority has double consciousness.
Right.
Double self-division. I have to deal with him one way, and when I see somebody other than myself, I have to put another mask.
Right, right. Well, you're absolutely correct. And, James Baldwin, another, kind of makes a similar argument in A Fire Next Time, which is now, become really popular again. But there's a new book, to your point, called Caste, C-A-S-T-E. I would encourage you to read. It makes the exact same argument, because you're right. It's not, race doesn't exist, but hierarchy does. And so the issue is, like you said, the absence of whiteness, because white, and this is what every immigrant that come into this country, you know, I have a lot of people that work for me that they're not Native Americans. So they come and they're trying to figure out what goes on here, this white-black thing. Well, you don't have to be here long before you figure out the hierarchy, right? And there's a reason why everybody that comes here wants to try to be honorarily white, right? Because the hierarchy is white on top and everything on the bottom. And so the question you proffer is a good one. And how do we change that? Well, that's an age-old question. But I do believe that through our experience of rising through the system, you know, it's kind of like what he said, you know, we have to get into those positions of power, and then only when you're in the room can you make a difference. You know, like I just said, I'm going to speak as a proud father. My son is about to go, and he's got a job on Wall Street. Well, again, those are very cloistered, you know, sort of positions. But we have to get in there if we're going to make a difference. Great point.
Just a little recognition. Lunch is next, so please don't leave. Where is Cynthia? Cynthia? You know, one of the, when you live that long or you're at a place for that long, you know, you have these heartbreaks where people you think would never ever leave, they decide to leave. Miss Gibson, I knew Miss Gibson as mother of one of my patients. And we got to know each other and we got to love each other. And when our son passed away, I was at the funeral and I spoke and I said, Cynthia, I have a job for you. And it became real, and a few years later, she joined us. And it's just been such a wonderful journey. You know, she's everything to us. Mother, sister, willing to help out. She's the preacher. She's when we have broken heart, you know, she's there to listen to us. And hours have never mattered to her. Patients call her 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. No food, no this. You know, they know who to call. Cynthia, when they come to my office, say, "Where's Miss Gibson?" So, and I hope they can still reach you. But Cynthia has decided to retire. She said she'll continue to work, but she has decided to retire because it's coming and driving. And you know, if I decide to retire, one of the biggest things would be, I was telling Michael, one of the biggest reasons would be the traffic on Georgia Avenue. So, and it keeps getting worse because they keep looking for oil or whatever else. So it's always dug up, right? So it's this very, very sad heart. I don't think she's going anywhere. Patty, I want you to read.
Okay, it says, Shining Star, awarded to Cynthia Gibson for reaching the pinnacle of success. In your pursuit of excellence, you've earned our utmost admiration and respect. With gratitude at your retirement, July 2022. So we'll celebrate more, but we just wanted to present you this today.
You announced the lunch. And,
Okay. So, yeah, we will be having lunch now. I don't know. What do you guys think? Can you do a 20-minute lunch? So we'll do about a 20-minute lunch. They've asked that you go out the door to that side. We have plenty of box lunches, salads, and we're going to have Mr. Brian Lanier will also be playing saxophone. Unfortunately, you cannot bring the lunch in here to eat, and we have some tables out there. So try to make your way back in by about 1:10, and then we'll do our last talk.